My name is Clara Bellamy. I am 41 years old. I live in New York City. I work in commercial real estate. And on the day my father died, my stepmother pointed at the door and told me to pack my bags. I said, okay. I packed my suitcase. I walked out the front door of the house where my father had lived for the last 15 years of his life. I checked into a hotel 6 miles away. I opened my laptop. I sent one email to his estate attorney. What Monica did not know, what she had never thought to ask about in 20 years, was that I owned a 22-story mixed-use building in Long Island City, that I had owned it since I was 30, that my father had spent 2 decades discussing it, reviewing its finances, meeting with its managers, and attending its refinancing meetings, not because it belonged to him, but because he was taking care of it for me. She had watched him work on that building for 20 years and had concluded it was his. She had never asked whose name was on the operating agreement. 5 days after she told me to leave, we sat across from each other in an attorney's office. That was when she found out what she had assumed and what had always been true.
Let me tell you about my mother first, because the building begins with her. Lydia Kessler Bellamy died when I was 13 years old. She came from a New York real estate family that had spent decades acquiring and improving commercial properties across the city. By the time she died, most of those properties had been sold, but one remained, Kessler Tower, a 22-story mixed-use building in Long Island City, Queens. The building sat inside a company called Kessler Tower, LLC. My mother owned that company. When she died, her interest in it went into a trust for me. I was 13. I could not manage a commercial property. So my father, Russell Bellamy, stepped in alongside a professional corporate trustee. He attended board meetings, he reviewed refinancing proposals, he spoke with property managers, he made sure nobody treated my inheritance as an opportunity. He was meticulous and careful, and he did it because he loved my mother and he loved me, and that was what fathers did. By the time my father married Monica, I was 19 years old. I was away at college. I had met Monica a handful of times, and I had found her civil and distant in equal measure. She seemed to find me the same. We never became close. We were both managing our relationship with my father from a respectful distance, and that was, for a long time, enough. What Monica saw over the next 20 years was my father on the phone discussing the tower. She saw him at the kitchen table reviewing budgets. She heard him talk about tenants and renovations and refinancing. She watched him travel to New York for meetings. She observed all of this, and she drew a conclusion that no one ever corrected. She concluded that Kessler Tower belonged to Russell.
Nobody staged a family meeting to tell her otherwise. My father hated uncomfortable financial conversations. He would refer to it as the New York building or the Long Island City property, never as Clara's building. He assumed everyone understood distinctions he had never clearly explained. At 30, I received control of the LLC under the terms of the trust. By then, I had built my own career in real estate. My father shifted from acting as my guardian to acting as my advisor. He still attended meetings, he still gave opinions, he just no longer had any ownership interest in the asset. Monica never asked to see the operating agreement. She never asked whose trust had held it. She never sat down with my father and said, "Tell me exactly how that building is structured and whose name is on what." She assumed. For 20 years, she assumed. And when my father died, she moved immediately to protect what she believed was hers. My father's final week did not feel dramatic while we were living through it. He had gone into hospital for cardiac surgery. He developed complications, and he never really recovered. I flew down from New York on the second day. Monica barely left his room. Neither did I for 4 days. We existed on bad coffee and whispered medical updates and the particular exhaustion that comes from sitting in a hospital corridor waiting for doctors to say something different.
Dad died just after noon on a Thursday. There was no final confession, no secret document slipped into my hand, no last-minute instruction about money. His estate plan had been in place for years. He had worked on it carefully and methodically with his attorney, Graham Leland, and he had told me its broad outlines long before he was ever sick. That evening, Monica and I returned to the house in Palm Beach County. I offered to call Graham. She told me she already knew how to reach him. I asked whether she wanted help notifying extended family. She said no. I walked toward my father's office to retrieve my phone charger from the desk. Monica followed me. She told me not to start going through his files. I told her I was getting my charger. She said she knew how these things worked. I looked at her and understood that grief had already become suspicion, that in the hours since my father had died, she had begun calculating what she stood to lose and had decided I was the most likely threat. She said, "This is my house now." I knew the house had been structured so Monica would retain it. I had never expected otherwise. I told her, yes, it was. I said it plainly and without resentment, because it was true and because I had no argument with it. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, she pointed toward the guest room and said, "Pack your bags, you're not staying here." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Okay."
That answer almost confused her. She had prepared herself for an argument. I did not give her one. I went to the guest room, packed my clothes, my laptop, my toiletries, and my charger. Nothing from my father's desk. Nothing from his closet. Nothing that belonged to him. At the front door, she told me the attorneys would contact me when there was something I was entitled to. I could have answered that. I knew what I owned. I knew what my father's estate plan contained. I knew that the building she had been watching him manage for 20 years had never been his to leave her. But none of that gave me the right to stay in her house. So I left. At the hotel, I opened my laptop and sent Graham one email. It said, "When we meet, I want every asset discussed by legal ownership first. No assumptions." I want to pause here, because packing a suitcase on the night your father dies and checking into a hotel while your stepmother locks the door behind you is not a moment that feels strategic. It feels like loss. It feels like standing outside something that should have included you and understanding that the person who decided it did not has no idea what they are standing on. I did not feel powerful that night. I felt the particular grief of losing a father who had spent 30 years taking care of things for me and who was no longer there. What I did not feel was afraid. If you have ever known something true that you were not yet ready to say out loud, drop a comment below. And subscribe right now, because what happened when Graham Leland opened that file 5 days later is the moment this story stopped being about grief and became about something else entirely. 5 days later, Graham scheduled a preliminary meeting at his office. Monica arrived first. I came in a few minutes after. A representative from the corporate trustee joined us. Graham began with the straightforward matters. The Florida house remained Monica's. My father had structured it that way. Certain retirement and beneficiary accounts passed directly to her. A substantial marital trust would provide long-term financial security. Monica would not be scrambling. She would remain, by any reasonable measure, a very wealthy woman. I said nothing. None of that was mine to contest, and I had no desire to contest it. My father had made his decisions, and I intended to administer them exactly as written. Graham moved through the estate methodically, separating assets into categories: joint property, beneficiary designated accounts, trust property, business interests, assets requiring further valuation, and, he noted it carefully, property that did not belong to Russell at all. Monica had been glancing at me throughout,
waiting for an objection. I gave her none. Then she leaned forward and asked about Russell's New York building. Graham stopped turning pages. He asked which building she meant. She said, Kessler Tower. There was a short silence. Graham said, Kessler Tower is not part of Russell's estate. Monica frowned. She said, What do you mean? He said, Russell did not own it at the time of his death. She looked at the trustee representative. She said, It must be in another trust. Graham said, None of Russell's trusts.
She asked, Then which trust owns it? He said, None of Russell's trusts. Monica's expression changed for the first time since I had walked into the room. She looked genuinely uncertain. She said, But he managed that building for 20 years. Graham nodded and said, He was involved with it. That is different from owning it. She turned and looked at me directly. I could see her trying to rearrange 20 years of assumptions. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for. She said, Then who owns the building? I held her gaze. I said, I do. She stared at me, not angry yet, just stunned. And then she said the sentence that told me she still had not understood what she had just heard. She said, Russell put it in your name? I said, No, Dad did not put it in my name. She said, Then how do you own it? I said, My mother did. That stopped her completely. Graham turned a document toward her and explained. When Lydia died, her interest in Kessler Tower LLC went into trust for Clara. Russell served in a fiduciary role alongside a professional trustee while Clara was a child. After Clara received the membership interest under the trust terms, Russell continued advising her. Monica shook her head. She said, But I watched him deal with that property for 20 years. I said, I know. She said, He reviewed financing, he met with managers, he approved renovations. I said, Yes. Her voice sharpened. She said, So you're telling me he did all of that for something he didn't own? I said, He was taking care of it for me. The room went quiet. That sentence seemed to bother her more than any of the documents. She had spent 20 years watching my father's involvement and reading it as proof of ownership. She had never considered that the same actions could have come from something entirely simpler. He was a father managing what his daughter had been too young to manage herself. Graham showed her the ownership history. The building was held by Kessler Tower LLC. My mother had owned the company. After her death, the interest went into my trust and was later distributed to me. There had been no recent transfer, no deathbed gift, no hidden deed my father had signed before surgery. The structure had existed long before Monica had ever married him. She looked at me and said, Why didn't you tell me? I said, Tell you what? She said, That building came up in our house constantly. I said, Dad discussed it because he advised me. She said, You let me believe it was his. I said, I did not manage your assumptions. That was the first moment she looked genuinely angry. Graham stepped in before the conversation became personal. He said Kessler Tower was not an estate asset. It did not pass under Russell's will or trust. It remained entirely outside the administration. Monica leaned back. Then she asked what she must have believed was the final question. She said, So that is the inheritance Clara gets? Graham looked at her steadily and said, No. She frowned. She said, What do you mean? He said, The tower is entirely separate. Then he turned to the next section of the estate summary. Monica looked at me. For the first time since I had walked into that room, she seemed to understand that the building was not the surprise. It was the valuation summary. He said, Based on the current numbers, Clara's beneficial share under Russell's estate plan is approximately $28 million. Monica did not move. Then she looked at me and said, "You knew this." I said, "I knew Dad's plan." She said, "And you sat in my house and said nothing." I said, "You weren't asking what I owned. You were telling me to pack." Her mouth tightened. Graham clarified that the figure was not $28 million in cash waiting to be transferred. It included securities, private investment interests, and trust assets still requiring full valuation and administration. Monica barely seemed to hear him. She said, "So she gets the tower and $28 million. Graham said, "The tower is not something she receives from Russell. She already owned it." That distinction mattered. Monica looked down at her own section of the summary and asked quietly, "And what exactly did Russell leave me?" Graham walked her through it: the Florida house, retirement and beneficiary assets passing directly to her, substantial liquidity, and the marital trust designed to provide income and financial security for the rest of her life. I said, "I am not challenging any of it."
She looked at me. I said, "Dad made his decisions. I intend to administer them exactly as he wrote them." For a moment, she seemed almost disappointed that I had given her nothing to fight. Then she looked back at Kessler Tower and said, "After 20 years of marriage, you expect me to believe I have no connection to that building?" I said, "I did not say you had no connection to it. Russell spent years working on it. It was part of your life together. I understand that." Her voice rose. She said, "Then I deserve part of it." That was the moment everything became simple. I looked at her and said, "You can inherit from my father. You cannot inherit from my mother through him." Monica froze. No one spoke. She finally said, "Your father put his time into that property." I said, "He was taking care of it for me." She said, "You keep saying that as if it erases 20 years. I said, "It does not erase anything. It explains ownership." She looked toward Graham and said, "This is still my house." I nodded. I said, "It is. That is why I left when you asked." That answer seemed to unsettle her more than any argument would have, because I was applying the same principle in both directions. Her house was hers, my mother's property was mine, my father's estate belonged wherever his documents said it belonged. Those were 3 separate things, and I was prepared to honor all 3 of them.
Monica stared at me. Then she said, "If I had known all this—" I stopped her gently. I said, "Known what?" She said, "That you had money." I let the question sit for a moment. Then I asked, "Would that have made me more welcome the night my father died?" Her face changed. She had no answer ready. A minute later, she closed the folder and said she wanted her own attorney to review everything. I said, "Of course." I was not afraid of another lawyer looking at the documents. I had spent my entire professional life watching people confuse involvement with ownership. Now Monica was going to learn the difference with her own counsel sitting beside her. Monica hired her own attorney the next morning. 3 weeks later, after reviewing the trust history, the LLC records, and my father's estate plan in full, her lawyer reached the same conclusion Graham had. Kessler Tower had never belonged to my father. There was no practical legal claim to make against it. Monica asked to meet me. She came to my hotel. She looked smaller somehow. Not poorer, just less certain. She said, "I did not understand how much I did not know." She admitted that after my father died, she had panicked. She knew I understood his investments. She knew I had worked alongside him on business matters for years.
She had convinced herself that if she did not establish control immediately, I would take something she believed was hers. I said, "So you pushed me out first?" She said, "Yes." I said, "You could have asked me what Dad planned." She said, "I know." Then she said something I had not expected. She said, "I hated that building, Kessler Tower. It always felt like your mother was still in the room." That explained more than the money ever had. My father had spent years discussing the property with Monica. Refinancing, renovations, tenant problems. Every conversation had sounded to her like another reminder of the woman who had come before her, my mother, Lydia Kessler Bellamy, still present in the room through a building that bore her family name. I said, "My mother's property was not an insult to your marriage." She said, "I know that now."
I said, Dad could have prevented some of this. He hated uncomfortable financial conversations. He would say, the New York building, instead of Clara's building. He assumed everyone understood distinctions he had never clearly explained. He should have been more direct with you. Monica nodded. Then she said, but that still did not make it his. I said, no, it did not. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I thought that if I pushed you out first, I could protect what Russell had left me. I was wrong. You were not trying to take anything from me. I accepted the apology. I did not pretend it repaired 20 years of distance. Some relationships recover through closeness. Ours recovered through accuracy. She knew what was hers. I knew what was mine. And for the first time since my father had died, nobody needed to take anything from anyone else. A year later, my father's estate was still being administered. Most of the major matters had been settled. I had received part of my inheritance. The remainder was tied to assets that required more time. Kessler Tower was still operating exactly as it had before my father died. The same management team, the same tenants, the same building he had spent 20 years caring for on my behalf. I still worked. I still lived in New York. Monica stayed in Florida, financially secure in the home my father had always intended her to have. We spoke occasionally, civilly. That was enough.
What changed most was how I understood that night. If Monica had known my net worth when she told me to pack, she might have spoken differently. That was exactly why I was glad I had not told her. Respect that appears only after a balance sheet is not respect. Her mistake was not asking me to leave her house, a house that was genuinely hers. Her mistake was assuming that everything important in my life had once belonged to my father. Some of it had. Some of it came from my mother, and some of it I had built entirely myself. The documents did not make me powerful. They simply made the boundaries impossible to ignore. And when the boundaries became impossible to ignore, Monica finally understood something my father had known for 30 years. Taking care of something is not the same as owning it. Drop a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And subscribe. I am here every week with a new story. She packed her bag and said, okay. She let the documents do the talking. The boundaries were always there. Now they were impossible to ignore.